Where are you physically, anyway?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, okay.
So we're recording now. All right,
That's a
hi.
place I've never been. Never been to the Southern California. I've been to San Francisco area and Northern California a few times.
Just imagine a sunny place that is just chock full of people, that you can never get away from humanity in Los Angeles. That's
Yeah.
really it is.
Endless freeways and
Endless
houses.
freeway, exactly. So you can't get away from them in your house, on the freeway, restaurant.
Yeah.
You line up for everything. It's almost like a communist system, but it's you have to line up for everything: gas, food.
Oh my.
Yeah. So it's, anyway,
I think I'll never go there.
it's good to visit, but it's good to leave as well. So anyway, 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is David Martin. He comes to us from D.C. He has just published a book. The title of the book is The Assassination of James Forrestal, and it was published May 21st, 2019. And David is going to talk to us in detail about his position regarding the demise of the first head of the Department of Defense right after World War II. DC Dave is his website, dcdave.com. I was a reader of David Martin when I was in DC back in the 90s, and it was basically him that I read a lot of, and Mike Rivero and Justin Raimondo of antiwar.com, who recently passed away, so that was a tragic loss. But so it's an honor for me to talk with David. And Mr. Martin, are you there?
I'm here.
Awesome.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for agreeing to the great. Thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who don't know you or your name, can you talk a little bit about your background and your journalistic interests and how you became interested in this particular subject?
Well, I just sort of eased into it, I guess. I guess it goes back. I have a PhD in economics from University of North Carolina in 1976 when I finally completed my dissertation. And then it was just a matter of making a living, I taught in college for 6 years and then went off on a big adventure and worked for the research office of the Economic Development Administration in Puerto Rico for 4 years, and then came up to Washington with the Puerto Rico governor's office. I had 3 kids, and I really didn't want them to grow up as not knowing who they were, being Puerto Ricans, and my wife was pretty restless too. And anyway, so we came to the Washington area. But my background in, I guess, conspiracy stuff, I'd always sort of followed the Kennedy assassination case just as a public-spirited person, but that's about the extent of it. And then the Oliver Stone movie came out, and at that point I really got really political because what I saw in the Stone movie was sort of, as they say in academia, kind of a collection of the literature on the subject that I had read. No big, huge revelations to me in it, but the absolute the frenzy, the negative frenzy of the news media over it, that was a big eye-opener to me at that point.
Right.
The news media is they're the problem. I saw right there the big problem, and right on the heels of I wrote a long poem called Assassins. It was sort of a therapeutic thing to get it out. My writing of verse comes from just a emotional outlet. I feel a strong emotion, and I got to say it somehow. It went to the drawer because there really wasn't any good outlet for something like that. But then about that time, here I'm living in Washington, and the Vince Foster case occurs. Well, Vince Foster was 2 years behind me at Davidson College in North Carolina. That's where I went undergraduate, graduated in '65. I didn't know him, but he was we were about the same height, so we matched up against each other in intramural basketball, but I didn't pay much attention to people in classes below me, so I really I didn't have any image of the guy, except I knew that he was, I read that he was, or I was reminded by reading that he'd been the president of Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity, and I was one of the few non-fraternity people there, so I played for the independents. And so I had an image of the guy as this typical party boy. That was about what he was at Davidson. But still, as a fellow Davidson student, I felt a certain fellow feeling, and nothing about this story added up. And so
right.
I got very much interested in the Foster case, and then reading about the Foster case, repeatedly I saw his death being described as the highest level government official to commit suicide, I put it in quotes, since Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. Well, from what I'm learning about the Foster case, I was pretty well persuaded that he didn't commit suicide, so that made me more curious about the Forrestal. And in the height of my curiosity, there was a good used bookstore that I frequented not far from where I live in Centerville, Virginia. They've since moved out for a lower rent in Manassas. But I ran across a biography of Walter Winchell, and I bought it, and I remember telling the sales clerk, this book could be dangerous in my hands. And sure enough it was, because in reading that book, I learned how much the Zionists hated James Forrestal because of his position against recognizing the State of Israel, and in fact that he was the leading opponent within the U.S. government of the creation of the State of Israel. And it become sort of a lightning rod of the Zionists. They really, you could tell they hated his guts. And here we know that they have a record of assassinations and terrorism. So, it just put two and two together. So I began to look into it. And the first place I went was the definitive biography by Townsend Hoops and Douglas Brinkley. Brinkley's now kind of a celebrity historian. He was the young assistant in that book. The Air Force executive in the Department of the Air Force.
And I think Brinkley, sorry to interrupt, but I think Brinkley is, he's done a biography of Hunter S. Thompson, kind of accessible historian. And Hoops himself was a Yale guy. He was a Skull and Bones member, right? Do you know that?
No. Hoops. Yeah, Hoops is a Yale guy.
Yeah, Skull and Bones as well.
Yeah, but Brinkley is sort of a protege of what's his name? Popular historian. He died a few years. Anyway, he was just making his bones at that point. But anyway, it's a quite good biography. Excellent. So I just get to the point, their chapter on his suicide. And the holes in the story are obvious as all get out, just from reading it. You can see they don't have any direct evidence. None of no quotes from anybody who was on the 16th floor of the Bethesda Naval Hospital that night. Not a single person weighs in, and hold on. So I find from reading references from other books, the key other book they reference in one point in a footnote is the Cornell Simpson book, The Death of James Forrestal, which is the only critical book that had been written. Only later did I find out that the publishing company is the official publisher of the John Birch Society, Western Islands Press. And there's a lot in that book that would lead you to believe that it was clearly a murder, an assassination. But they point the finger at the communists and not the Zionists. But I learned a lot from that. But the key thing is that the Hoops and Brinkley book did not even mention that there was an official investigation that had been kept secret. They didn't tell you that it existed.
Right, and what was the name of that investigation?
Well, I've called it the Wilcott report after Admiral Morton Wilcott, who was the head of the National Naval Medical Center, which has responsibility for Bethesda Naval Hospital. Admiral Morton C. Wilcott. It's easy just to remember it as like the Warren Commission report. I call it the Wilcott report.
Gotcha.
And they took testimony. It was in the newspapers that there was going to be this hearing and they were going to take testimony, because it's not really a proper investigation. The people who took the testimony were all medical doctors, with one exception, I think. But they were all medical doctors at the hospital. What the hell? I mean, they're not qualified. And it shows, they don't ask the right questions. And you never learn. I mean, you can tell there, from reading the testimony, there actually was a police investigation. That would be the Navy police. They took fingerprints, and they did. You can tell there was, but that's nowhere on the record anywhere. There was a police investigation, but that's still secret.
Gotcha.
The only thing that is now public since I got it, my third try with the Freedom of Information Act request, was that 3-day hearing. But then after they did the hearing, took all the testimony, it was never released. Only almost 6 months later, a summary of the findings I found it buried away in the New York Times. Almost 6 months later, the summary of the findings, and lo and behold, the summary of the findings, it did not say that he had committed suicide. It didn't conclude. So officially, when you talk about what's the official story, well, officially there is no conclusion that he committed suicide. The press just tells you that.
Wow.
They officially concluded that he died from the fall from the 16th floor window. They don't say what caused the fall.
Right.
Which is, they just say that nobody employed by the Navy was responsible for it. In other words, they gave themselves a clean bill of health.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
The absolved all individuals of blame, I think, is what was in the thing, and they couldn't explain why a sash was around his neck too, right?
They did not. They made no mention. They made no mention in that their short conclusion of the sash around his neck. The newspapers all called it his bathroom sash. We don't know that. We don't know what kind of rope it really was. And I got as part of the FOIA request, I got a lot of the official photographs. And we got the photographs of the room, and the room across the hall with the open window out of when she went. But none of the photographs of the body. Well, that body those photographs would have shown you the sash around his neck. The newspapers tell you that he was using that to tie to the radiator beneath the window to hang himself out of the window. and Hoops and Brinkley say the sash gave way. What the hell does that mean? It gave way. The official testimony that it was not broken, so that tells you the knot came untied. What is the likelihood of that? What is the likelihood that he would not realize that jumping out of a 16th floor window would be quite sufficient if you want to kill yourself? You don't really need to hang yourself out of the window. The whole thing is so preposterous.
Right.
Just on its face, it's preposterous. But the official report conclusion made no mention of they just ignored it as if it didn't exist. And the newspapers just complete that preposterous story that he was using, and then using it to hang himself out of the window. Several secondhand accounts say that it broke. Others say that it came untied. Oh, ridiculous! One of the things, if you actually got to see the photographs, undoubtedly you'd see that it was used to throttle him, more than likely, and if being used to throttle him, it would probably have about equal lengths left over. There would not have been nearly enough left over for him to have also tied it around the radiator beneath the window and maneuver himself out of the window. That's what it would have shown, and that's probably the main reason why I was not allowed to see it. Now, first they told me that it was out of sensitivity to the feelings of the family that they were keeping those back. Well, but they said I could send a letter of protest and they would consider it. Well, I did. And what I told them was that he had no really surviving relatives who knew him. Both of his sons were dead by that time. He had one surviving grandchild who didn't even know her father. Her father was an alcoholic like his mother. Had died when I think before this granddaughter was born. She didn't know her father. She obviously didn't know her grandfather. So he's like an ancestor to her, So you don't have to protect her feelings, her sensitivity. So then they came back and said, well, they were in error with their explanation the first time. The true reason they can't send it to me is that those photographs, would you believe, have been lost. And that's all mentioned in the book, I believe.
Yeah, not surprising.
The whole thing is just so preposterous. So, at this point, you really don't have to believe. It's hard to believe anything.
And the other thing is, it happened it was May 22nd, 1949, on the 16th floor of a Bethesda Naval Hospital. So it's in a kind of nice part of Northwest Washington, D.C.
Right off Wisconsin Avenue.
Yeah, and it was in the middle of the night. It kind of brings to mind Epstein, like what's going on in the middle of the night at this hospital, and who was there?
Yeah, well, this Epstein thing is something else. It does bring to mind
some similarities. Why the middle of the night?
They're asking to believe a lot of really unbelievable things.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, you point that out, I think, effectively in your book about all of these other problems that this whole poem, like there was a narrative somebody seemed to want to put together to make it look like, he was a goner. And then they keyed up this whole element about him being hyper paranoid, and even his brother Henry, I think you said he didn't believe it was a suicide. So there were people there from the beginning who didn't believe there was suicide.
There's big similarities with the Foster case and the Kennedy assassination. The news media are not the eyes and ears of the public whatsoever. They bend over backwards to sell the suicide story. I mean, they go past the government. The government officially has not called it suicide, you know. Although they did initially, a local coroner, the Montgomery County coroner, called it suicide. But that's not the job of the coroner. I mean, this is a police case. He's gone out of the window. This is what police it's their job to determine, you know, what caused him to go out the window. Was it an accident? Was he thrown out of the window, or did he go voluntarily to kill himself? This is what police do. How's a coroner going to know what caused him? I mean, at that point, you don't even know if he's full of shot up with drugs and out of his mind. You know,
right.
You don't know anything. The coroner doesn't know anything. So, I mean, how credulous do the news people have to be to take the word of a local coroner? It makes no sense, you know. And then they really play up this morbid poem that he was supposedly transcribing from Sophocles, a chorus from Ajax, in which Ajax supposedly contemplates suicide. And they say that, you know, they have two stories depending upon what edition you read. The first story is that the book was open to that page that he was reading, and then we have an actual transcription that comes into the picture. You know, and when I did the part one of Who Killed James Forrestal, I had not at that point actually looked at the handwriting to compare it to Forrestal's handwriting. I mean, surely, you know, you'd think that they would have gone to the trouble to fake his handwriting. Well, as it turned out, they didn't. Any untrained eye can look at, we finally got copies of his hand. I could have just looked at his signature, which is under his portrait in the published diaries, the diaries of James Forrestal. You can look at his signature there. He writes, although he was right-handed, he writes like a left-hander. His cursive writing leans to the left rather than naturally to the right, like most right-handers. I mean, that's the most obvious difference. I mean, so what was presented, I expected after I pointed this out that people would say, well, what we sent you was not the actual transcription, but they never said that.
Interesting.
So it's supposedly the actual transcription. Clearly that's not he didn't do it. So what else do you need at that point? You know?
Right.
But again, the news media is they're sticking with it.
Right. That's our story. We'll stick with it. Yeah.
That was his handwriting.
But I mean, there were suspicions. I mean, right from the beginning, he was not liked by the Zionists and the communists. He was a known anti-communist, but also
absolutely known anti-communist and known and in fact that's why. And he was at cross purposes with a lot of people within the Roosevelt administration. He was all against the unconditional surrender demands, which dragged out the war all to the benefit of the Soviet Union. Certainly in the Pacific Theater, it benefited the Soviet Union. I mean, they had a non-aggression pact with Japan throughout World War II, you know, and they only dropped it after we dropped the second bomb, the second A-bomb. And at that point, they declared war on Japan. There's no reason for them to reap any of the spoils of victory in the Pacific campaign. And Forrestal was trying through naval intelligence people. He knew that the Japanese were trying to surrender for a couple of years almost. They knew they were beaten, but we led them to believe that we were going to hang the emperor and get rid of the emperor whole system and impose who knows what on them. They would have fought with forks and pitchforks and shovels to the last Japanese as long as we held out that unconditional surrender demand. And it was he who persuaded Truman to drop it, that unconditional surrender demand. I explained the details in the book,
right.
But we have him to credit the clever formula that he worked out. They said that they agreed to everything except they're going to keep the emperor. And Forrestal came back to Truman and said, well, why don't we say, well, okay, we'll accept that under condition that the emperor is subject to the orders of the U.S. military commander. And we'll tell the American people it's unconditional surrender. And that's what worked.
So that ended it.
So we would have gone on. They would have gone on fighting, and a lot more people would have been killed, but for that clever arrangement that Forrestal suggested to Truman.
He was a talented person in that administration, but he also, the reality is that there were communists around the U.S. at the time he was complaining about the communists. So it wasn't like he was seeing flying pigs or something.
Oh, yeah, they're talking about paranoid. Yeah, well, all this paranoia they accuse him of was genuine, not just, he was being, his phones were being tapped. He was definitely, both the communists and the Zionists were his arch opponents, and the Roosevelt and then the Truman administration was laced with communists at a very high level.
Right, Alger Hiss.
Yeah, it was genuine.
Right, and his whole thing wasn't, his antagonism with the Zionists was not based on ethnic animosity. At least that's what they seem to have made it up. But he thought that there was going to be tension between the new state of Israel and the Arab powers, and that's really what. And I think you go through your book, effectively make that point that.
It was pure realpolitik,
Yeah.
He didn't want to alienate. These countries that had all this oil. And he thought that he probably thought that the Zionists were going to be militarily weaker than they were, and we were going to have to use American troops to defend them. So it was very, just sort of a cold, realistic approach to matters. But he also saw that in the long term it was just not in American interest, and he was absolutely right as it's turned out. It's been nothing but a headache for us to the present day.
And there were,
he was the most foresighted person in the administration.
So he might have perceived that what was coming. But there were other assassinations around the time that he died. There was the assassination of Fulk Bernadotte in Jerusalem in 1948. There was Jan Masaryk, who fell out of a window too. And you also brought up the Olson death involving the use of drugs. That happened later.
Comes a little bit later. Yeah, that's a CIA job on one of their own.
Right. So these suspicious things are happening, and his death happened in. Oh, it was also Lord Moyne died in March 1949. There was the bombing.
The blowing up of the King David
Hotel. Right. So there's all kinds of things, and you brought up an interesting point that you called this person. The Forrestal of the UK. His name was James Bevan. Ernest Bevan? Can you talk about him a little bit?
Ernest Bevan was and he comes from the labor movement and labor generally was very pro-Zionist, but he really was just a straight shooter, and he wanted to stick to the letter of the law of the Balfour Declaration, that nothing would be done to prejudice the interests of the non-Jews in Palestine. Well, if you take that seriously, you're not going to partition Palestine and give a disproportionate share of Palestine to these European interlopers, which they really are. I mean, at the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and like less than 10% of the population of Palestine was Jewish. And they
Right.
and so I mean, Bevin became, all this time that the British had the mandate of control of Palestine. So before the U.S. became the principal arbiters, after the British threw up their hands, before that time, all the focus of the Zionist attention was on the British government. And the Jewish terrorists, they didn't just kill high-level people. They also killed the policemen and soldiers and other people trying to keep order in Palestine, to terrorize the British out of there. And they sent letter bombs to Ernest Bevin, and he was the foreign secretary, and to several other high-level officials. And they were intercepted, and they didn't reach their target. But when one Zionist even tried to stage an air raid against
Right.
that's in the book.
From France.
Yeah, against Bevin, and it was because we knew about that, never got publicized in this country, that the letter bomb in 1947 that was sent to the Truman White House was intercepted.
Right, so
they tried to kill Truman.
Right, so hyper motivated, very motivated, and also not just using assassination, but also blackmail. So you can.
That's another thing. Blackmail has been a big part of it, and actually I point out one of the sources that I use. The co-authors, I can't think of it. They boast about Jewish blackmail of people like Nelson Rockefeller, because Nelson Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family had a lot of influence in Latin America. But the Rockefellers had done a lot of business dealings with the Nazis in the 1930s, and they used that. This guy writing, the pro-Zionist, writes proudly about how they blackmailed Nelson Rockefeller to use his influence with Latin American governments to vote for partition of Palestine. And like, this is just a fine thing. And they tried to blackmail Forrestal, because the Dillon Reed company that he had worked for had done business with the Nazis. But it didn't work with Forrestal. And I surmise probably one of the reasons Dillon Reed was a Jewish-owned company.
Right, like his boss was Jewish, right?
Clarence Dillon, his birth name is Lepowski, is a Jew from San Antonio, Texas.
Right.
And I mean, so the blackmail didn't work with Forrestal. So if the blackmail didn't work, let's try it. Now, people might argue, well, he was out of the government by the time they killed him. But as I point out in the book, his first love was journalism, and that's where the power is in the country. That I don't know if you've read my America's Dreyfus Affair, the case of the death of Vincent Foster.
No, I haven't read it.
But I began with a quote from Abraham Lincoln that I've dredged up and made popular. I'll gladly take credit for that. The quote is from his first Lincoln-Douglas debate, when he said, "In this and like societies, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, anything is possible. Without public sentiment, nothing is possible. Therefore, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than people who make laws and issue judgments." In other words, the press is stronger than the government. And that's what we're seeing.
Right.
It's a very. I was watching C-SPAN one night, and I saw a reenactment of the first Lincoln-Douglas debate, and I heard the Lincoln character say that this bingo. So I found a book of quotes from Lincoln, and I found that quote, and then I put it at the start. I mean that's really this molding of public sentiment is everything, in a society that purports to be a democracy.
And I think that's a good.
How do I get off on that?
No, it's an interesting point, because I think that's how you're also very critical of these other historians who've approached the Forrestal death, about what they've left out and their own agendas, etc.
All of them. I mean, if you try to ask yourself, who is an honorable journalist in this country that you can trust implicitly? I can't think of one.
Yeah, it's tough. That's a real hard question.
Who is an honorable historian that you can trust implicitly?
It's another good question.
I can't think of one.
Yeah,
I really can't think of one. The best history of things like the Kennedy assassination are being written by people like me who were not professional historians. That's like Phil Nelson, who was a retired insurance man. And he's written these books about the LBJ's involvement in the Kennedy assassination. I have definitive books on that subject. I don't know if I just finished a powerhouse book, The Myth of German Villainy, by Benton Bradbury. I've never heard of the guy, and unfortunately, the time I've heard of the guy, he's dead now. He's a little older than me. But he was a retired Navy officer, not a historian. Great. I mean, he references a lot of late great historians, people like Harry Elmer Barnes and Charles Beard. But we don't have those people. John Flynn, who was a journalist who we don't hear about anymore. But he has a lot of good sources, but we just don't have any historians like that anymore.
Yeah, it's a shame.
So the history profession and the journalistic profession are they're part of what I call the NOMA. You read the book, what NOMA stands for?
I don't know.
The National Opinion Molding Apparatus.
Makes perfect sense. I mean, isn't that what corporate media is? That's all it is shaping people's perceptions, not really trying to relate facts, as far as I can tell.
And that's what is the National Opinion Molding Apparatus? Yeah. Well, it's the game.
Right.
Government, academia, media, and entertainment.
Right. So if you can control that, if you can control those people, if you can finance these histories, you get your own view of reality, and then people will quote that false history as well, is what's really dangerous, and you can see that in your book, is that people are going back through to look at very skewed histories and referencing that in the future. So you can see, like, what did Napoleon say? History is bunk. I think that applies in many historical events.
Yeah.
Anyway, Dave, we are at 40 minutes. Thank you so much for the interview. Your website, again, is dcdave.com. You have a ton of writing there. What else would you like to leave with the audience before we wrap this up?
Well, I've co-written another book. You get both of them as a match set. This is the Martyrdom of Thomas Merton.
The Martyrdom of Thomas Merton. That's interesting.
You don't have to be a Catholic to be interested in that. And there's another. He was the big three that were assassinated in 1968. His death occurred on December 10th.
So he supposedly, I think the public story is that a piece of electric equipment fell into a pool and electrocuted him to death, right?
Yeah, that's what they want us to believe.
Right.
And Hugh Turley and I had been wondering about that for quite a long time. And finally he began to do the research on it, and I mean, just you can't believe the things that come out about that.
Well, it's odd too, because you have a very meticulous historian who writes 20 books or something like that, a very copious amount of literature with he's a first-rate mind, and then absent-mindedly drops a toaster or whatever it was into the bathtub and he dies.
They say again officially he died of a heart failure.
Oh, okay.
That's what the Thai police say, that if although the police report is unsigned and undated and the translation is not stamped as an official translation by the U.S. Embassy like all the other documents we got, so who knows? But anyway, they concluded that he died of heart failure and was already dead by the time he came in contact with that fan, which was found lying diagonally across his supine body with his arms straight down by his side. and officially he had not taken a shower. None of the witnesses said that he was wet from a shower or anything. One of the witnesses said he looked like he might have been getting ready to take a shower because he was only wearing his shorts. And he had taken his habit off and was just wearing his shorts. But
when was that book published? When did you publish that one?
The year before. Just
okay.
It was the success of that book that caused us to decide to do the Forrestal book as a book. Well, that came out in March of last year.
That's 2018. And you wrote that with Christopher Ruddy, who is also a Vince Foster researcher, correct?
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
So you guys have been busy overturning some stuff.
We've exposed Ruddy pretty well, I think.
Oh, you have exposed Ruddy? As what?
Huh?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Read my article, Double Agent Ruddy Reaches for Media Pinnacle.
Okay, but did you write the book about Merton with Ruddy?
Oh, no, with Turley.
Turley, I missed that. Okay, I made a mistake.
Did I say Ruddy? I mean, you Turley.
I made a mistake. I mistook Turley for Ruddy.
Well, they're both Irish names.
Okay, I apologize.
And Ruddy claims to be an Irish Catholic because I suppose his father was an Irish policeman, and he had a large family. Sounds like typical Irishman. Never says anything about his mother, but Ruddy studied for a time at Hebrew University.
Interesting. But Turley was one of the original Vince Foster.
Absolutely.
He
was he and Patrick Knowlton and John Clark, the lawyer for Knowlton, and Knowlton is the witness, the dissident witness in the Foster case. Right. The three of them together wrote the
addendum,
the letter to the Star.
Right, it's the addendum to the Star report, right?
The addendum, and then they wrote Failure of the Public Trust, right, which was originally a court submission, but it's turned into a book. So they're the three co-authors, and they have the FBICoverup.com website.
Right.
So, Turley and I are we're collaborators.
Gotcha. I misunderstood.
You, Turley. Well, I might have said Ruddy by mistake.
No, I might have heard it. I think it was my mistake, so I apologize for that. But I would love to talk with you about that as well. If you have time, maybe next month or sometime, I'd like to pin down an interview about that book. It sounds very interesting. I'd like to know more about Merton as well. But again, this...
either or Turley or I I could do that interview.
Okay.
Turley knows that case inside and out.
Right. Well, I can get in touch with him as well. But again,
he made the key discovery. The initial designated biographer of Merton actually made off with two negatives of a photograph of Merton's body taken by one of the witnesses. When the witness realized the charade that the Thai, he was going to give these photographs to the Thai police, but when he saw the charade they were pulling off, he decided that they better not give it to them. And this is a Filipino monk, priest from the Philippines. Anyway.
What do you think the motivation was to assassinate Merton?
Merton was if you want to know the motivation, read the introduction to James Douglas's book on the Kennedy assassination. You'll see what a behind-the-scenes influence Merton was in the anti-war movement. He was a big influence on Daniel Berrigan. He had a mailing list that didn't quit, including Ethel Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's wife, that he sent his letters to. He had even sent a couple of strong letters to Lyndon Johnson, which that might have signed his death certificate right there.
Wow, that's amazing, and that's interesting you bring that up because Forrestal himself was friends with John F. Kennedy and took John F. Kennedy to the Potsdam Conference. So
James Tracy has done a good video that you might check it. Go to heresycentral.com, which is I'm collaborating with John Rivusky. I have my stuff on there.
Gotcha.
But Tracy has a new video he's done on Merton.
I see.
That you'll find it on heresycentral.net. It is.
And the Douglas book is JFK the Unspeakable, right? It's that one?
That's correct, yeah. It's probably now really the best known book on the Kennedy, best known critical book on the Kennedy assassination these days.
Well, I'd like to wrap it up now, Dave. You're at 50 minutes. Again, the title of the book is The Assassination of James Forrestal, available now on Amazon. And your website, again, is dcdave.com. Thank you so much for the interview.
Well, it was my pleasure. I appreciate the interview, and I'm glad I held up for the whole thing.
Awesome. Well, you did great. So I'm done recording.